Vangella Buchanan was born in Jamaica and migrated to the United States in 1989. She began publishing in the 1980s. Her work has been published in Focus, The Caribbean Writer, and New Writing from the Caribbean. A graduate of Miko Teachers College in Jamaica, she holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Eastern Connecticut State University, a Master of Arts in Communication from the University of Hartford, and a Master of Arts in English from Central Connecticut State University. She also holds a doctorate from CCSU.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me, for hosting me at today's Central Author event. As mentioned before, I am an alumna of Central Connecticut State University, and of course, I'm owner of a small publishing company and a bookstore in Bloomfield, Connecticut. So today I'm here to talk about one of my books, The Master's Daughter. And The Master's Daughter is the story of a young mulatto girl named Felice, whose Scottish father, Duncan Henderson, a plantation owner in the British colony of Jamaica, decides to acknowledge her as his daughter and give her all the privileges associated with being the daughter of a plantation owner. The story is set in the mid-1700s, and it begins with a major slave revolt that takes the reader through a journey of both the enslaved and the master in the 18th century, as upheavals occur simultaneously in the colonies, including America. So, how did I come to write The Master's Daughter? Well, as a student at CCSU completing a master's degree in English, I decided to examine the Creole woman in West Indian and Caribbean literature of the 19th century and to present this as part of my thesis. Now, that was one of the most amazing journeys I've taken. So before I started my research, I was of the perception that Creole and mulatto were synonymous. Well, I was in for an awakening. Now, if you've read the novel Jane Eyre, you would have encountered Bertha Mason, the so-called mad wife of Mr. Rochester. Now, Mr. Rochester is a white man who travels to Jamaica and meets and marries Bertha Mason, who is a Creole. And of course, there are numerous articles that have been written about Bertha Mason. There are numerous perspectives, theoretical perspectives, through which she has been examined. But my focus in my writing was on Bertha Mason as a Creole female in Caribbean West Indian literature. Now, when we think of Creole, we immediately think of Louisiana, right? That's what jumps to our thoughts. But as I read more and more, I realized that the Creole was part of the West Indian history. It was part of the West Indian experience. So what was a Creole, or who was a Creole? Is it a race? Is it an ethnicity? So in my research, I discovered that the term or the word Creole carried no racial designation in the 18th century or further into the 19th century. So one could be entirely European or African or of mixed ancestry and still be considered Creole. It simply meant that you were native to the colony. That's all it meant at that time. So you could be a white Creole, you could be a black Creole. You could have an animal or a plant that was Creole. It simply meant that you were born in the colony, your parents were from elsewhere. Now, the narrative at the time was that the Creole white was inferior to the European white. And this is what we see in Jane Eyre. It was said that they were not as civilized as the European white. We had writers like Edward Long, who was a British historian. He presented the Creole as a deviant. And so because the white Creole associated so much with the blacks in the colony, they were different. They were inferior. And so that's what I learned the Creole meant. Thinking about back to Bertha Mason, it was Jane Eyre, of course, in Jane Eyre. When Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, she had never traveled outside of England. So her writings were largely based on what people like Edward Long were writing, historians, travel writers, who were writing about the Creole and the Creole experience. In fact, in Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte describes her as dark, describes Bertha Mason as dark, discolored, and black. However, she was a white Creole. On top of that, she talked about how Bertha Mason's parents wanted her to marry Rochester because he was of a good race. And so that was what I recognized the Creole to be as I did my research. However, as I researched some more, I discovered the mulatto and realized, as I mentioned before, that there were two different entities. Now, I use the word mulatto in the context of the time because now we consider it to be an offensive phrase, an offensive word. People don't use it anymore. We prefer to say biracial. However, in the interest of the story, I will use the word mulatto. So please, when I use it, just assume it's in quotes. So a mulatto is a person of mixed white and black ancestry. That's it. It is a legacy of attempts to categorize race, a concept that science has shown is socially constructed, that it has no biological basis. So one of the themes in The Master's Daughter is the relationship between black and white, and of course the product of that relationship. Interestingly, in the era of slavery in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, as it was known at the time, it's a little bit different from the experience in America. But what I've discovered as I did my research was that the experiences were simultaneous. It's almost as if the world was at war. And I think of it as the First World War, because of what was happening in the then known world. So back to The Master's Daughter. Now, in our enlightened 21st century, we see the relationship between the master and the slave as a power versus powerlessness relationship. That's how we see it. However, at the time, it did not necessarily mean that this is how they saw it. The product of a relationship between a black and white in this era, and of course the book is set in the 1700s, so in the 18th century, racial relationships were different based on what I was reading. Now, I'm not a historian, and I don't claim to be the expert on all of this, but as I did my research and the thoughts on writing The Master's Daughter started emerging, I realized that the relationship between black and white was somewhat different than how we see it. In our 21st century, we can look at it and we can judge based on our experiences now. But at the time, the dynamics of relationships between black and white was really interesting. And I think, too, part of it was because this was in the West Indies, an island. And so we look at that also in The Master's Daughter. So the fact that the white and black combination created a new being, as it were, that is labeled mulatto, is interesting. Because, for one thing, it distinguished that person from everybody else. And this is what happens to Felice in The Master's Daughter. She's not really white, and she's not really black. So it places Felice in a very awkward position. She's kind of caught in the middle, on the playground, as it were. So the black children play together, the white children play together. Where does Felice belong? She cannot play with the white children. First of all, there are not enough in the colony for her to even associate with. And she's not white. And so she can't claim any friends. The black children play together because they are enslaved. And most of their days are spent in the fields working what they call the gangs. They would weed the plantation. That was their job. So they didn't really play. And even if they had playtime, Felice did not belong there. So Felice is one of the fortunate mulattoes in the colony. When she's very young, her father, who is Scottish, returns from his trip to Scotland, and she's old enough now, he recognizes that, I'm going to take care of my daughter. And so he calls her to him and says, you know what, you're my daughter, and I am going to take care of you. And Felice has no idea what to do because before that, she played with the other children. She had a favorite playmate who was a slave, but they were together. But now her father takes her to the big house and or the great house as we call it, and decides that he is going to take care of his daughter. So what he does, he gets her a tutor. But Felice doesn't want that. She wants to be out there and enjoying doing what everybody else is doing because she doesn't even see the difference in the shade of her skin. She just knows she's a child and why am I doing this? Where is she going to go with this, what she's learning now, the training she's getting? She's being taught to read and write. She's being taught certain social graces, but where is she going to take that? And so she's caught in a rather unique position. Felice, as I mentioned, is one of the fortunate ones because a lot of mulattoes did not get that privilege. A lot of them were simply not acknowledged by their fathers. And so they were left to fend for themselves. Often they would end up in the fields, or they would perhaps end up working in the house, but with nothing more than the clothes on their back. There was no future for them. So of course, Mr. Henderson, Duncan Henderson, acknowledges his daughter, and he decides he's going to take care of her. Being a mulatto, of course, she knows she's different because as she ages, as she gets older, she recognizes that there's something different, that she's getting certain privileges that her playmates, former playmates, are not getting. And so in this book, I also explore the hierarchy that has been created because of this relationship between black and white. That now we have mulattoes, we have octoroons, we have quadroons, and so many other racial classifications that people are placed into, and this created a kind of hierarchy in the system. And if you think about it, it's any colony. This is what occurred not only in Jamaica and other West Indian colonies, but it was also occurring to the similar extent in America. Bear in mind, at this time, America was, fighting for independence also, to not be a colony of the British any longer. So this is why I talk about it in terms of the simultaneous occurrences in the colonies. And at that time, it was very fascinating. I'm no historian, but I was so fascinated by the occurrences in terms of, I think it was the whole world, as they knew it then, was involved in wars. The French, the Spanish, everyone was, so I wrote about that in terms of how this affected the colonies, how the war that was going on in America and other places was affecting the colonies. So speaking of race relations, one of the things I discovered as I did more research was something called white by law. Now, there was a private act in the 18th century that allowed a white man who had fathered non-white children to use this private act and present it to the National Assembly. And what this act did was give the same rights and privileges of British subjects to the children, the non-white children of the plantation owners. So these were born of white parents, and so they were given this opportunity to be declared white by law. Now, being declared white by law, there were certain restrictions involved with that. You had certain rights and privileges as British subjects did. However, there were restrictions on voting, and there were restrictions on who you could marry, which I found interesting for Felice, because here she is a mulatto, and so we have to think about her future because she doesn't remain a child. She grows up. So we have to think of her future. So does this law, white by law, apply to her? So in the records, you will see children who have been declared white by law because of this private act. So as I read more, I was really curious. What if a young girl living on an 18th century plantation in Jamaica discovers that her father is the plantation owner, and he decides to accept her as his child and raise her as such? What are some of the dilemmas this child would face? And so I dug in, I really explored questions like, to whom do I really belong? Am I black? Am I white? And so she can't fit in with whites, right? Because of that social structure, because at that time, most of the people with the money, the upper class, if you want to call them that, were white. They were plantation owners. And of course, everything else, you have the mulatto and the quadroon and all of those. So, of course, there weren't enough whites on the island for her to really hang out with. So what does she do? The blacks are in the fields working all day. So even as she grows up and becomes a woman, she is kind of stuck in that in-between place because she doesn't really belong anywhere. And a question that I had to ask myself, who is her mother really? And what role does her mother play in the story? She realizes that her mother is an enslaved woman, right? But who is she really? And how does she navigate her world with her mother? And that is one of the interesting points, I think, in the story. The woman we discover is her mother, and she plays a really huge role in the actual story. You got to read it, right? And of course, her sibling, who is, she knows who her sibling is. She discovers eventually. But how do you relate to her? Because now your sibling is enslaved. Your sibling is not your father's child. Your sibling is enslaved. You live in the plantation house. How do you navigate that relationship with your sibling? Is there even one? And so that is something that I thought about, that would be a dilemma for a young girl growing up at that time and being caught on the playground, as it were, in that in-between space. Who will I marry when I grow up? I'm a mulatto. Who will I marry? Now, there is a sequel to this. It's called The Master's Wife. So she eventually does get married, but how? How does she get married? Because technically, a mulatto could not marry, as it were. She could marry another mulatto, but do we have enough on the island for her to find a suitable mate? Her options were she could marry a mulatto, another mulatto, but of course the other mulattoes are looking to move up, right? What does she have to offer another mulatto? Also, she can't marry a white man because the law doesn't allow it. So the general practice at the time was for the white man to take a mulatto as his mistress, give her a house, give her somewhere to live, and he would take care of her. Sometimes they would give them, a shop or a store, like a haberdashery or something like that for them to manage, so they could be independent. So Felice is really caught in that position where What do I do as I grow up? Who will want me? And so, interesting. The sequel takes care of what happens when she does become a wife. These are just some of the issues that are faced by this young woman in The Master's Daughter. Again, as I mentioned, when we think of race relations, we can, kind of judge it based on what we know in our 21st century. But at that time, the navigation of relationships between the so-called races is interesting. I had the opportunity to read excerpts of a diary from a man called Thomas Thistlewood. He was a character. It was rather enlightening because what he did was he documented his day-to-day activities. And so you got a really good idea of what the plantation life was like. And he actually had a slave wife. She was called Fibba. And as I read his diary, I realized he was really in love with her, which is interesting at that time, the dynamics of the relationships between black and white. And so when we look at this in our 21st century enlightenment, we think of this in terms of, oh, here's a master taking advantage of a slave. But in this case, with Thomas Thistlewood and Fibba, they had a real relationship in that she was his slave wife, and when she was sent, but she didn't belong to him. When she was sent to another plantation to work, his heart was broken. He could not function. He left his plantation and went to get her and bring her back. And so I thought about the relationship between Felice's father and mother. Could it be that it was real love? Or is it that we still have to look at it in terms of someone taking advantage of someone else because of their power? And so I realized that the relationships at that time between black and white was very fluid in terms of how people navigated their world. We have to think in terms of, I thought in terms of putting myself in the shoes of those people who lived at that time. If I had been there, what would I have done? How would I have navigated my world? And so this is how the whole idea of The Master's Daughter came about in terms of looking at relationships, looking at how people navigated their world, looking at the relationships between master and slave or enslaved. Here is a man who has a child with a woman he cannot marry. How does he feel? Does he really love her, or is it that she was useful at the time? How does the enslaved mother relate to her mulatto daughter, who is now in the plantation and part of what we would think of as the upper class? How does she relate to her daughter? She can't even discipline her daughter. Can she acknowledge her daughter in public? Everyone knows that's her daughter, but in public, she cannot perform the role of a mother. She can't go over and hug her daughter because that's just not part of society. So this is, this was how I walked through writing The Master's Daughter. And I think it was very easy for me to write in terms of just being able to tell the story and getting the voices of people I thought lived, getting their voices heard. The story is really historical. I followed very closely the historical events of that period of time. However, of course, the characters are fictional, but I do believe that they must have existed. I think I'm telling the story of people who actually existed. And what the writing of this did for me was open my eyes to a different world in terms of I have to understand that people live their lives. 100 years from now, someone is going to be examining my life and saying, oh my goodness, she did this, this, this. But on a day-to-day basis, we live our lives. And so as we look back at history, I think I'm getting a peek into the lives of people who actually lived. They might have, they might not have, but their stories, I think, are real. So I'm going to give you a little snippet of The Master's Daughter. It starts out with an event that was historic in Jamaica in terms of how, the slaves, the enslaved, how they fought for freedom. So I'm going to give you a quick snippet of what happened in Felice's case. So this is a chapter 2. I have a couple minutes, so let me see how quickly I can get it done. The carriage rumbled up the hill and came to a stop in front of the great house. Felice peeked from behind the heavy drapes in the drawing room and watched the occupants alight. It had been a busy morning as the final touches were put on the house to welcome the new occupants. The house was like new. Even the yard seemed to have been washed clean. The slaves in the field paused a moment to watch the cloud of dust that signaled their arrival, risking the wrath of the driver. The woman who alighted was long-faced, with a nose that seemed to have spent its entire 30 years pointed in the air. Her dark green gown was heavy and unsuited for the tropical climate. Her blonde hair was partly hidden by a hat, studded with what looked like flowers. Beneath this, rivulets of sweat were dripping down the sides of her face and onto her dress. She stood for a moment in the open carriage, surveying everything around her before turning to the 2 children who gazed in wonder at the house and vast fields below and around them. The footman alighted, one extending his hand to the new lady of the house. Mary Henderson paused a moment before lightly resting a gloved hand in that of the Negro to her right. Duncan Henderson came around from the other side of the carriage to take his wife's arm. And I'm going to stop there, giving you a little teaser. This is the arrival of Duncan Henderson's wife from Scotland. And so everything now changes in terms of what position Felice occupies in that household. His wife is Scottish, his children are white, and they're Felice's brothers and sisters. What will be the relationship between and among them? Thank you so much for participating today. What questions do you have? Do I have time for questions? Yes. What questions do you have for me?
I was wondering, and you said it's set in the 1700s, and then you follow up, as she's older. What effect would the war for independence in America have had on her status or
on
just her life in general in this character?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. What effect would it have on their?
On her status, or her life and her just like relations with other people.
Okay, good question. The effect that the war for independence and all of that affected Felice not in terms of her status, because this is one of the things in the colonies, when I talk about race relationships, it was very fluid. Black and white, it was very fluid. And one of the reasons perhaps is that there were fewer whites than blacks. But the effect it had on the colony in general was that there was no trading allowed with America. And so people were starving. People had to find ways around it. And so her father, the plantation owner, how does he provide? He had to find ways around providing for his family. And so this is how it affected Felice in terms of the availability of supplies. But her position in the house, in the hierarchy, it did not change. She still was the master's daughter. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes, yes.
So, historical fiction, I always love historical fiction.
Yes.
And one of the things that's always interesting to me is try to figure out how the stories of these characters in historical periods are relevant to us today, right? And so, I mean, there's a reason why we write and read stories set in the past. What do you think who is the Felice of today? That is, who who is experiencing the same kind of in-betweenness, stuck between two identities, and who would benefit from reading this book and understanding her story?
Okay, I think anyone would benefit from reading this book in terms of maybe struggling with your identity. So in our society, you know, some years gone by, there was a lot of rhetoric about biracial individuals and, you know, the struggle with identity. So that kind of, you know, it was relevant at the time. Now in our 21st century, there are people still struggling with different forms of identity. And so I think it is relevant to our society now for anyone who actually has a struggle with who they are. You know, where do I really belong? And I think it goes beyond a racial category or label. It goes further than that. Anyone who gets to a point in their life where they're not sure where they belong. And so I think this book kind of takes you through that internal struggle, because not only does Felice struggle, but the other, my favorite character is actually Morgiana. I call her Morgie. And I'm going to let you into the secret that she is actually Felice's sister, but she doesn't know until much later that she, you know, and so she wants to be free, but she knows, you know, she belongs here, but she struggles to gain her freedom and her independence. But she also knows that this is where she belongs. So I hope I answered your question. All right, thank you. Any other?
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a wonderful afternoon.